So what is history, and why does it matter to us here today? I imagine that most of you are familiar with the famous quote by Edmund Burke about history, that those who do not remember it are doomed to repeat it. And this is one of the most commonly cited reasons for us to consider the value of knowing our history, to avoid the errors of the past, to learn lessons much as a child learns not to place a hand on a hot stove. Cicero, the Roman philosopher, had a similar quote, in which he declares that those who do not know history remain forever children. Without it, we do not understand the context of our own lives. He adds, "What is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history?" This, too, is another reason to value history, to be part of something larger than ourselves, to connect with the shoulders that we now stand upon. As Unitarian Universalists, we value our interconnectedness, and I would hazard to say we also value our history as a faith. We trace it back to the Middle Ages, finding strands of heretical faiths that weave through our past and lead to our present community. We treasure figures of the early faith, the writers of the Transcendentalist movement, the leaders from our ranks, and the values which were once seemed radical or even blasphemous, but which have come over time to become mainstream in many parts of the world. We also value the idea that revelation and truth is in a constant state of expression, and so we seek in our spiritual and intellectual ancestors both wisdom and models of being. But history is a tricky business. It was Napoleon who perhaps said it best when he said, "History is a set of lies agreed upon." And this has largely been the case for much of our existence as a people who record, recall, and retell stories of our past. History is written by the victors is another well-known truism, speaking to the reality that most of what we have studied as history has been told to us with ulterior motives. It is told to us to separate us from them, to lift up one vision of how things came to pass and dispel others, to build national identity or personal narrative, to persuade, sometimes to hide the ugly and raise up the noble, to diminish some in the favor of others. This is why the value of history is both immeasurable and yet precarious. The truth, if we can say about such things, is that history will always be incomplete, imperfect, and inevitably biased in some fashion. But this is to be expected of us. We are imperfect beings. Why should our story of ourselves somehow become perfected? Even when we witness events ourselves, our minds add details that were not there. We enhance and enrich when our perception is incomplete. Studies have shown that eyewitness testimony is inevitably flawed and illusory. So if we cannot trust our own memories of events, which we have personally witnessed, what hope is there to understand history? The key to understanding history and about its telling, I would argue, is that it tells us both about the subject of the story and about the teller of the story. What is emphasized? Who is the hero and who is the villain? Which values are raised up and which are reviled? These are the questions which reveal as much about the present as they do about the past. And we should be as keen to understand the people telling us the stories as the stories themselves. And this is why recent trends in who tells the stories and how they are told are so significant. While there are still those publishing history books, particularly textbooks apparently for use in Texas, who like to write about the transfer of millions of African workers to the United States, and there are plenty of politicians and pundits who believe the role of history in education is to create patriotic Americans, not to tell the full story, the often bloody and downright unpleasant story that is America, nor to help our children develop the critical thinking skills they need to know when an agreed-upon lie is being told to them. Though these ideas of what history are should still be out there and are still out there, they are becoming harder to defend. We are fortunate to live in an age where the idea of history being told by the victors is being challenged. When the lives of the defeated, the oppressed, the victims, and the unsung are held up as examples. When the stories of those who have always been ignored or worse, held down are recorded and retold with as much fervor and fascination as the stories of the leaders, rulers, and victors, then we have a history that is worthy of our attention. George Orwell once said that the most effective way to destroy a people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. I would argue that to tell only partial stories, to only hear the story of the powerful, does much the same. How we understand ourselves is wrapped up in how we understand or are led to understand those who came before us. By learning the history of those who are not kings or generals, presidents or heroes, to go beyond Washington's cherry tree or the Alamo, Daniel Boone or Buzz Aldrin, we can learn even more about who we are as a people than if we focus only on hero worship and images that swell our hearts with patriotism. It is still somewhat controversial in our nation to study Black history, Hispanic heritage, herstory, or LGBT history. We often confine these things to a given month of a year or a special chapter in a textbook because they do not fit into a narrative about ourselves that has been told for so long that we barely notice that it is happening. And even doing this, even creating a space at all for alternate stories, stories that shed light on the suffering and injustice that has also been seen in our history, just this act is seen by some as inciting division or denigrating our nation. It is unimaginable to these people that we should spend as much time understanding the slaves of Mount Vernon as we do the powdered-wigged owner of the estate. The value of studying other forms of history is that doing so reveals truths that go unseen if we only use history to glorify and celebrate. Many of you are probably familiar with the historian Howard Zinn, the author of A People's History of the United States. He's not a figure unknown to controversy, and his book is still very much a lightning rod for criticism, particularly by those who believe that history should be used as a tool of nationalism and hero worship. Howard Zinn studies the story of ideas and of the people, often unnamed, regularly unrecognized as leaders or legends, the oppressed and those who rise from oppression to create change. His vision of history is that it is the mass, the teeming movement of people toward change that is the real driver of history. To quote Dr. Zinn, he says, "We don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world." Okay, I fear already that as preamble to our discussion of LGBT history, I may have gone on too long. I tend to be a little long-winded. I know this about myself. But I do want to leave this first reflection with the thought that as we consider what we know and do not know about LGBT history today, that we do so in search of those small actions that have built where we are now, and those which we can do and invite others to do today and tomorrow, so that the multiplied power of ordinary action can be made real. Small acts of kindness, but also acts of disobedience. Because it is in our disobedience to the status quo that change erupts, in a million tiny acts of revolution and a million questions of why things are the way they are and why they cannot be better. To quote one last time from Howard Zinn's writing, he says, "Historically, the most terrible things, war, genocide, slavery, have resulted not from disobedience, but from obedience." We learn history of the past to learn how we, acting together, can move towards the future.
Don't know much about LGBT history. That was true of me up until the age of 26. Now, I had many lesbian and gay friends in college. Ironically, I knew most of them through my involvement in the Catholic Newman Center. We knew, but we didn't use the words, or even know the words to describe their love. A part of them was made invisible. That changed for me when, in late 1982, a friend gave me a copy of the book, The Mayor of Castro Street, The Life and Times of Harvey Milk. His brother had given a copy to each of his siblings for Christmas as his way of coming out to them. I began to learn about and be more aware of the struggles of LGBT folks both then and now. Many date LGBTQIA history from the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. Patrons of the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village rioted when police officers attempted to raid the popular gay bar. Such raids were frequent then. They were the police officers' efforts to try and clean up the neighborhood of sexual deviance. But did you know, efforts of LGBT Americans started long before. Now, we could talk about the Native Americans, in which case LGBT persons were called two-spirited in many nations and were considered to be revered. But I'm talking about U.S. history. In 1924, Henry Gerber formed the Society for Human Rights in Chicago, the first gay rights organization in the U.S. Soon after its founding, though, the society disbanded due to political pressure. It wasn't until 1950 that the first national gay rights organization formed. I believe it's pronounced Mattachine. Does anybody know? The Mattachine Society aimed to eliminate discrimination, derision, and bigotry, and to cultivate the notion of, quote, an ethical homosexual culture, end quote. And there was a lot of discrimination to eliminate. In the same year, a Senate report entitled Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government was distributed to all members of Congress. The report stated that, since homosexuality is a mental illness, homosexuals constitute security risks to the nation. In 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower signed an executive order banning homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance, though many mental health and other professionals immediately criticized the categorization for its lack of research. So what was going on in the Unitarian Universalist congregation at that time? In 1967, a survey was published regarding the beliefs and attitudes within the Unitarian Universalist denomination. At the time, nearly 8% of UUs believed that homosexuality should be discouraged by law. 80% believed it should be discouraged by education, not law, and only 13% believed that it should not be discouraged. So this was the culture, both within our congregation and in our nation, that led to the Stonewall riots in '69. Individuals who were suspected of being gay or lesbian were harassed, arrested, banned from government employment, and looked down upon as somehow deviant. 3 months after the Stonewall riots, at the UU Student Religious Liberals Conference, the Reverend James L. Stuhl publicly declared himself to be homosexual. The UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association, was quick to react to Stonewall and the growing movement. In 1970, there was a General Assembly resolution to end discrimination against homosexuals and bisexuals. One can only imagine the endless discussion at GA, at General Assembly. After all, this was only 3 years after that study showed 88% of UUs believed homosexuality should be discouraged. But there were also those pesky principles of Unitarian Universalism. At the time, the third of the 6 principles read, in part, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man. That later became our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The resolution was quickly followed in true UU style with the creation of an Office of Gay Affairs and educational curricula about your sexuality and the invisible minority. By 1979, there was a UU conference called GALA, Gay and Lesbians Affirmed. Just 6 years after homosexuality was removed from the American Psychiatric Association DSM diagnoses of mental illness. And all this occurred before I ever read that biography of Harvey Milk, at a time when many of my gay and lesbian Catholic friends still didn't have a name for what they were experiencing. In the 80s, the UUA went on to affirm the practice of its clergy performing same-sex services of union and to develop the Welcoming Congregation program. Now, you can read more LGBT history, and I encourage you to do so, and we have some UU history handouts at the back, and we'll have them down at coffee hour. It's all available and out there, but why is it important for us to read up, to learn, to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable with new topics? Well, it's important because history gives LGBTQ youths and adults role models. Because it helps us understand where we are and where we are going. Because our stories matter and every individual has a need to be known. And as Alan said, because if people make cultures change through their actions and beliefs, understanding how it's been done will help us make positive changes in the future.